Welcome back to the deep dive. You know, when we analyze history, we so often look at it through this grand lens.
Right, the big picture. We talk about decades of rising tensions, huge economic shifts, these deep-seated generational grudges.
Things that feel inevitable, like a force of nature. But sometimes history doesn't pivot on a century. It pivots on a few seconds.
We like to think of it as a massive dam, all that water building up behind it. That's the years of slow, crushing political pressure, the forces that everyone can see.
And today, we're not looking at the water, we're looking for the crack. That one tiny catastrophic failure in the concrete that lets the entire flood out and just changes the landscape forever.
And that crack doesn't take decades to form. It happens in an instant.
Our dam today is early 20th century Europe. And the water.
Well, that's the massive, undeniable pressure of South Slav nationalism colliding head-on with the fragile, multi-ethnic Austro-Hungarian Empire.
But the crack we're diving into today is a single, almost unbelievable wrong turn in the city of Sarajevo on June 28, 1914. So our mission for this deep dive is to analyze the events of that morning with really almost forensic precision. We want to understand how the entire history of the 20th century, we're talking the collapse of empires, the death of millions, how all of it hinged on a moment of pure confusion.
Human error and just sheer dumb luck. It really is the ultimate story of fragility.
To do that, we've structured this into three parts, and we're going to move from the macro forces right down to that single micro moment.
First, we'll talk about the water. The immense geopolitical pressure, the intense nationalism that turned the Balkans into a powder keg, just waiting for a spark.
Then we'll zoom right in on the crack. The chaotic, minute-by-minute details of that morning, focusing on the failed plot, the incredible breakdown in security, and that fateful wrong turn.
And finally, we'll trace the flood, the terrifying cascading consequences that followed, what we now call the July Crisis and the outbreak of the First World War.
Okay, let's get into it. So, to really understand why one assassination in what was essentially a provincial city could just shatter the entire world order, we have to go back. We can't start in 1914.
No, absolutely not. We have to establish the source of that immense pressure. And for that, we need to go back a little further to the year 1908.
Right, because the plot against the Archduke, this wasn't just some random act of madness. It was a direct response to something.
It was a direct reaction to what the Serbian nationalist movement saw as a profound administrative injustice. And that was the official annexation of Bosnia and Herzegovina by Austria-Hungary on October 6, 1908.
Now, for a lot of us listening, that might sound like a dry diplomatic footnote in a history book. So why was that act so explosive on the ground? Why did it matter so much in Belgrade, and especially to Bosnian Serbs?
Well, you have to understand the dream. For centuries, the Balkan Slavs had this powerful vision of unification. Some called it Greater Serbia, others a unified South Slav state, a Yugoslavia.
And Bosnia and Herzegovina had a huge Serb population.
A huge one.
Yeah.
And while the territory had been administered by the Habsburg Empire since 1878, it was still, technically, under the sovereignty of the Ottoman Empire.
So it was in this kind of political limbo.
Exactly, a limbo that kept the dream of unification alive. So when Vienna just formally annexes it in 1908, they're not just grabbing territory.
They're extinguishing a hope.
They're extinguishing hope for every Serb living there. And just as importantly, they're delivering a massive public insult to the Kingdom of Serbia, which saw itself as the natural protector and future liberator of those people.
So this one act just pours fuel on the fire of Serbian nationalism.
Overnight, it made the conflict between Belgrade and Vienna feel existential. It created this deep, burning anti-Habsburg sentiment that basically said diplomacy is useless. The only way forward is to destabilize the empire.
Which brings us to the conspirators themselves. They weren't operating in a vacuum.
Not at all. They were a direct product of this tension. Their plot was driven by one thing, a desire to shatter the Austro-Hungarian Empire from within.
And their goal was purely political. This wasn't for money. This wasn't personal revenge.
No, it was entirely ideological. It was about achieving that national dream. The assassination was meant to be the ultimate provocation. It was meant to prove that the empire couldn't hold on to its Slav territories.
And we have some incredible documentation here, including accounts from the conspirators themselves. Borijev Yevtich, right, he was a key figure, arrested right alongside Gavrilo Princip.
That's right. And he later provided a very detailed eyewitness account. And his words just confirmed the motive. The goal was always to advance the nationalist cause, to achieve what they saw as the ultimate liberation of Bosnia from Habsburg rule.
So that ideology then dictates the target. It had to be Archduke Franz Ferdinand.
It had to be. He wasn't just some random official. He was the heir to the entire throne. But here's where it gets really complicated and, frankly, fascinating.
Because Franz Ferdinand wasn't exactly a hardliner, was he?
Not at all. In fact, he was known to favor a policy called trialism. The idea was to reform the empire's structure.
From a dual monarchy, Austria and Hungary, to a triple monarchy.
Exactly. Giving the Slav populations of the empire a political voice, a status, equal to the Austrians and the Hungarians.
Okay, now that seems completely contradictory. If he was relatively sympathetic to the Slavs, why assassinate him? Wouldn't that actually hurt their cause? You might get a much harder line successor.
That is a brilliant point, and it's precisely why the plot was so provocative and, in their view, so necessary. The hardline nationalists, they feared trialism even more than they hated the status quo.
Because it might have worked?
It might have worked. If Franz Ferdinand had succeeded, if he'd reformed the empire and granted the Slavs greater autonomy. Well, the entire reason for a violent revolution, the dream of breaking away to join Serbia.
It would have just evaporated. The steam would have gone out of the movement.
Completely. So they saw him not just as a symbol of their oppression, but as a direct threat to their revolutionary goal.
So in a terrifying way, they were killing him not because of what he was, but because of what he might have become. The man who could have fixed the problem non-violently.
It's a chilling political calculation. And then you layer on top of all that the timing of the visit. Franz Ferdinand arrives in Sarajevo, a city already pulsing with this nationalist rage, on June 28, 1914.
And that date, June 28th, is not just another day on the calendar for Serbs.
It's probably the most significant date. It's the anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo in 1389.
A catastrophic defeat against the Ottomans that led to centuries of foreign domination. It's a day of national mourning, but also of resistance and revival.
And for the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne to visit Sarajevo on that specific day to observe military maneuvers, I mean, you can imagine how that was seen.
It wasn't just poor scheduling.
It was seen as a deliberate, calculated demonstration of Habsburg dominance, an act of provocation to a population that was already right on the edge.
So let's recap the pressure here. We have the deep geopolitical wound from the 1908 annexation. We have the existential threat that the Archduke's potential reforms pose to the nationalist cause. And we have the incredibly inflammatory timing of the visit itself.
The water is absolutely cresting the top of the dam.
All right, let's move into the day itself, the day the crack appears.
So we shift now to the morning of June 28th, 1914. And what you see immediately is just a complete organizational meltdown that allowed this whole tragedy to unfold.
The Archduke's entire motorcade route had been published in advance. Everyone knew where he was going to be and when.
Which is just staggering from a security perspective. And waiting along that route, primarily on the main road, the Apple Quay, were 7 conspirators, 7, all armed, including, of course, Gavrilo Princip.
7 points of potential catastrophe, or, as it turned out, 7 opportunities for the plot to fail. And at first, it did. It failed spectacularly.
The security failures were just glaring from the very start. Sarajevo was known to be a hotbed of anti-Habsburg sentiment, yet the security presence around the royal couple was shockingly light.
General Oskar Potiorek, the military governor of Bosnia, was in charge of the arrangements, right? He was actually in the car with the Archduke.
He was. And his plan was inadequate, to put it mildly. They didn't clear the crowds back from the street. They didn't properly screen the spectators who were lining the route. It was incredibly lax.
And the official party was just completely exposed. The Archduke and his wife, Sophie, were in the third car of the motorcade, a Greffenstift open-top sports car.
Not an armored limousine. Not even an enclosed vehicle. They were sitting ducks, traveling slowly through what was effectively hostile territory.
So the first critical moment of the morning happens at about 10:10 a.m.
That's when the first conspirator, a young man named Nedeljko Abramovich, makes his move. He throws a hand bomb directly at the Archduke's car.
And this is the moment. This is where history should have just veered safely back on course, because the bomb misses.
It does. There are a few different accounts, but the most likely one is that the driver, Leopold Lojka, saw it coming and accelerated, or the Archduke himself actually deflected it with his arm.
So the bomb bounces off the folded-back convertible roof of the car.
And it rolls into the 4th car in the motorcade behind them and detonates. It injures somewhere between 16 and 20 people, a mix of officials in the car and spectators on the street.
But the primary targets, Franz Ferdinand and Sophie, are completely unharmed.
Completely. The immediate reaction is chaos, of course,
Mm.
but the motorcade does the sensible thing. It speeds away from the explosion and continues on to its planned destination, the town hall.
What happened to Abramovich, the bomber?
Well, his escape plan was almost comically inept. He swallowed a cyanide capsule he was carrying.
To avoid capture.
Right, but the cyanide was old or ineffective. It just made him violently ill. So then he jumps into the nearby Miljacka River to drown himself.
Mm-hmm.
And it's summer. The river was only a few inches deep. He basically just landed in the mud and was pulled out by police and angry bystanders almost immediately.
So at this moment, let's say 10.1 feet in the morning, the conspiracy is an abject failure. One assassin is captured, the Archduke is safe, and the motorcade has sped past the other 6 conspirators, including Princip.
It's over.
Yeah.
The mission is, for all intents and purposes, completely finished. The remaining assassins just sort of melt back into the crowd, defeated.
The Archduke gets to the town hall, and he's furious. He apparently interrupts the mayor's prepared welcome speech, shouting something like, "I come here as your guest, and you people greet me with bombs."
He was shaken, understandably. But it's in this meeting at the town hall that the second truly fatal error is set in motion.
Because despite the assassination attempt, General Potirek and the Archduke decide to carry on with the reception. But then Franz Ferdinand insists on a major change to the schedule.
A noble gesture, really. He wants to go visit the people who were injured by the bomb blast. He wants to see them at the hospital.
Okay, a humanitarian impulse. But that means changing the route.
It necessitates a critical route change. The original plan had them winding through the narrow, crowded streets of the old city center. The new plan was much safer.
What was it?
Just drive straight.
Yeah.
Go straight along the main road, the Appel Equi, directly to the hospital on the edge of town. Avoid the narrow streets entirely. Logically, this was a huge improvement in security.
But a great security plan is useless if you don't tell anyone about it. And this is where we see the true catalyst for the disaster.
A complete, staggering, almost unbelievable breakdown in communication.
We have to focus on the driver, Leopold Loschka. His testimony in the investigation afterward is it's damning.
He states it very clearly. He was not informed of the new route plan. General Potirek's staff, in the chaos and rush after the bombing, simply failed to tell the driver.
Let's just pause on that. The man whose entire job is to drive the car safely, the man sitting literally feet in front of the general who made the decision,
Was not given the updated security brief after a bomb has already been thrown at them.
It defies all logic. It speaks to the panic, the chaos, maybe the arrogance of the officials in that moment.
Absolutely. They were rushing to adjust the schedule to make this noble hospital visit happen. And in that rush, the most fundamental protocol tell the person steering the car where to go was catastrophically ignored.
So Loschka is now driving away from the town hall, operating under the assumption that the original pre-bomb route plan is still in effect.
He thinks he's supposed to drive down the Apple Quay for a bit and then turn right into the city center, following that original dangerous route.
And this communication failure, this is the single most important human error of the entire 20th century.
The first part of the conspiracy, the part with the bomb and the planning, it was a total failure. But the second, accidental part, well, it was guaranteed success by sheer bureaucratic incompetence.
And this is where we enter the fulcrum moment, a pause of maybe 5 seconds that completely changed the world.
So first, let's just correct that persistent myth that you always hear. Gavrilo Princip was not some patient, calculating assassin lurking in the shadows waiting for a second chance.
Right, the story of him calmly eating a sandwich.
That's almost certainly a fabrication, an embellishment added later to make the story better. The reality is much more mundane and, frankly, much more tragic in its coincidence. Princip
Couldn't have given up. The whole operation had failed.
Utterly. He had moved away from the main route, the Appel Quay, and had walked over to a spot near the Latin Bridge. He was standing outside a delicatessen, Schiller's delicatessen. Whether he was eating or not is debatable, but the location is confirmed. He was defeated. He was just there.
So he's standing there probably replaying the failure in his mind, maybe thinking about what to do next. And then around 10:45 a.m., he looks up.
And he sees the Greffen-Stift open-top sports car carrying the Archduke, Sophie, and General Potirek driving slowly toward his position.
A car that should never have been there.
It should have been miles away, speeding straight down the Apple Quay to the hospital. But the driver, Loschka, is still following his original outdated instructions, and he makes the turn.
He turns right. He mistakenly turns off the wide, safe Apple Quay and onto the narrow Franz Joseph Street.
A turn that history pivots on. It takes the car, with the heir to an empire inside, directly in front of Schiller's delicatessen, directly in front of the one conspirator who happens to be standing there by pure random chance.
General Potiorek, sitting in the car, realizes the mistake immediately.
He sees the car veering onto the old, dangerous route, and he shouts at the driver. Something like, "What is this? This is the wrong way. We're supposed to go down the Krai."
And Loshka, in a panic, realizing his catastrophic error, does what any driver would do. He tries to fix it. Instantly.
He slams on the brakes to stop the car. He needs to reverse, to back the car out of Franz Joseph Street and get back onto the main road.
And this is it. This is the window.
This is the 5 seconds. Because he stops so abruptly, and because he's trying to get the car into reverse, the car either stalls or it just pauses significantly.
Long enough.
Long enough for Gavrilo Princip, who can't believe his eyes, to see the royal couple. Stationary, completely exposed, and maybe 5 feet away from him, history just handed him an impossible second chance on a silver platter.
The sheer coincidence is just... it's breathtaking. The motorcade was moving. Had they just kept going down the wrong street to turn around later, they might have been fine.
Or if Potiorek hadn't shouted, maybe Loshka wouldn't have panicked and slammed on the brakes. But he did, and the car stopped dead.
And let's be clear, this was not a mechanical failure. That's another myth. The car didn't just happen to break down at that spot.
No, absolutely not. The driver stopped it.
Yeah.
He stopped it to correct a navigational error that was caused by a communication failure. This entire assassination was facilitated by a chain of human blunders, not by a faulty engine.
Princip, who was only 19 years old, doesn't hesitate. He steps forward, maybe onto the car's running board, draws his FN model 1910 pistol,
and fires 2 shots from point-blank range.
The official Austrian report, which includes Princip's own confession, confirms the chilling details.
Yes. The first bullet struck Sophie in the abdomen. The second struck the Archduke in the neck, severing his jugular vein.
The story of Sophie is especially heartbreaking. She was pregnant at the time. She died almost instantly. The Archduke's last words were apparently whispered to her, "Sophie, Sophie, don't die. Stay alive for our children."
He died just minutes later as the car, in a panic, sped back toward the governor's residence.
So just think about that fragility one more time. If Podiorek's staff had briefed the driver,
They'd have sped safely past.
if Potiorek hadn't shouted at that exact second,
Maybe Loshka doesn't panic brake.
if the car doesn't stall for those 5 seconds,
Princip never gets a clear shot. A conspiracy of 7 men with a bomb was a total failure. But it succeeded because of a few feet of asphalt, a confused driver, and a communications breakdown. It is the ultimate testament to the role of pure accident in history.
the shots are fired, the Archduke and his wife are dead. And what was a local, albeit tragic, event in Sarajevo, it now begins to transform almost instantly into a global crisis that Europe's leaders seemed utterly incapable of managing.
The floodgates are now wide open.
What happened to Princip immediately after?
He was arrested on the spot, of course, and because of his age, he was just shy of his 20th birthday. He was ineligible for the death penalty under Habsburg law, so he received the maximum sentence, which was 20 years in prison.
And he didn't survive it.
No. He died in prison from tuberculosis in April 1918, just a few months before the end of the very war that he, through this bizarre chain of events, had helped to unleash.
So the story now moves from that street corner in Sarajevo into the halls of power across Europe. This is the beginning of what historians call the July crisis.
Right. The assassination gave Vienna the perfect pretext, the one they had been looking for, really, to finally crush Serbia.
But they didn't act immediately, did they? There was this strange pause. The assassination is on June 28th, but Austria-Hungary waits for weeks. Why?
They needed to be sure of one thing, that their primary ally, Germany, had their back no matter what. This leads to one of the most critical diplomatic miscalculations of the entire era.
The so-called blank check.
Exactly.
Yeah.
On July 5th, an Austrian envoy meets with Kaiser Wilhelm II in Germany. They ask for absolute assurance that Germany will support them, regardless of the measures they take against Serbia, even if it leads to war with Russia.
And the Kaiser gave it to them.
Without hesitation. He and his chancellor provided unconditional support. They gave Vienna carte blanche to escalate as much as they wanted. It was a stunning gamble.
And that blank check was the decisive factor, wasn't it? It emboldened Vienna.
Completely. It told them they didn't have to fear Russia's intervention, or at least that if Russia did intervene, Germany was prepared to fight. That assurance is what allowed Vienna to pursue a strategy of absolute confrontation rather than mediation.
So, armed with this German backing, Austria-Hungary finally makes its move. On July 23, 1914, they deliver an ultimatum to Serbia.
And this was the political equivalent of lighting the fuse to the powder keg. The terms were deliberately designed to be impossible to accept.
What were they demanding?
All sorts of things. The suppression of all anti-Austrian publications, the dissolution of nationalist organizations. But the real poison pill was the final point.
Which was?
Vienna demanded the right for Austro-Hungarian officials to participate in the judicial investigation against the conspirators on Serbian soil.
That's a complete surrender of sovereignty.
It's unthinkable.
Yeah.
No self-respecting nation could ever agree to let a foreign power conduct police work on its territory. Vienna knew this. They wanted the ultimatum to be rejected. They needed their pretext for war.
But Serbia almost called their bluff.
They came incredibly close. Knowing the danger, the Serbs accepted almost all of the terms, offering only the mildest reservations about that one sovereignty-infringing clause. But it wasn't enough for Vienna. They were committed to war.
So 5 days later, on July 28, 1914, Austria-Hungary officially declares war on Serbia.
The first domino has fallen. And this is where that complex, interlocking system of European alliances, which for decades was meant to prevent a major war through deterrence, suddenly becomes a doomsday machine, a conveyor belt to global conflict.
So once Vienna declares war, the gears start turning automatically.
They do. Russia, seeing itself as the protector of the Slavic peoples and bound by treaty to Serbia, begins to mobilize its massive army in response.
And Russia's mobilization is seen by Germany as a direct existential threat.
It is. The German war plan, the famous Schlieffen Plan, was built on a rigid timetable. They assumed they would have to fight a two-front war against both France and Russia. The plan dictated they had to knock France out quickly in the west before the slow-moving Russian army could fully mobilize in the east.
So Russian mobilization meant the German clock started ticking.
Exactly. They couldn't afford to wait. The leaders are sending these frantic diplomatic telegrams, but at the same time, the generals are issuing these irreversible mobilization orders. And in 1914, a full mobilization was seen as an act of war itself.
The timeline just accelerates terrifyingly fast now.
On August 1st, just 4 days after the initial declaration, Germany declares war on Russia, activating that central alliance chain.
France, obligated by its treaty with Russia, immediately prepares for war.
And Germany, following the Schlieffen Plan, can't wait. To get to France quickly, they demand passage through neutral Belgium.
Which brings the final great power into the fight.
It does. Britain had a treaty from 1839 guaranteeing Belgian neutrality. When Germany invades Belgium on August 4th, Britain has its reason to go to war.
So on August 4th, Britain declares war on Germany, and because of the vastness of the British Empire, the European conflict becomes a world war, instantly.
In 37 days, from 2 shots fired from a stalled car to a global war involving millions, the speed is just breathtaking.
The consequences are almost too vast to comprehend.
You're talking about the end of the world as they knew it. The Great War toppled 4 massive empires: the Austro-Hungarian, the Ottoman, the Russian, and the German.
It killed over 20 million people, soldiers and civilians, and its effects didn't even stop there.
Not even close. The punitive Treaty of Versailles, the economic devastation across Europe, the rise of fascism and communism, these were all direct consequences of that conflict. It set the stage for World War II, the Holocaust, and the entire geopolitical structure of the Cold War.
Basically, our entire modern world was forged in the chaos unleashed by those 2 shots.
And to really frame the magnitude of this series of blunders, you have to look at the work of historian Christopher Clark.
In his book, The Sleepwalkers.
Exactly. Clark argues powerfully against the old blame game, trying to pin the whole war on one country. He says that's too simple.
Instead, he sees the war as the result of a complex web of decisions made by actors all across Europe, none of whom fully grasped the catastrophe they were stumbling into.
He calls them sleepwalkers. They were smart men, skilled diplomats, but they were acting on outdated assumptions. They failed to realize that modern weaponry and rigid alliances meant that their old-fashioned diplomatic crises were no longer manageable.
And the story of the assassination is the perfect micro-example of that macro thesis.
It's the perfect storm of sleepwalking. The failure to secure the route, the impulsive decision to visit the hospital, the communication lapse, Podiorek's shout, Lojka's breaking. Each one was a small, individual, almost trivial human error.
But together, they combined to trigger the greatest catastrophe the world had ever seen. The world didn't march to war. It stumbled into it because someone forgot to update the driver's itinerary.
So as we kind of bring all this together, the single overriding insight for me is just the terrifying fragility of it all.
Right. We're conditioned to think of history as this grand, inevitable march, that huge conflicts are predestined by economic forces or deep cultural clashes. We assume the big causes are so powerful that the specific trigger doesn't really matter.
But the story of June 28, 1914, just completely shatters that assumption. It shows that global conflict, the end of empires, the deaths of millions, it all hinged not on some grand, unavoidable trajectory.
But on a missed security briefing, a confused driver following an old map, and the car that stalled for 5 crucial seconds.
The ultimate lesson, Sarajevo, is that the meticulously planned conspiracy to change the world was a dismal failure. But random human errors succeeded where determination and a bomb could not.
It's just a powerful and, frankly, a very sobering reminder that history isn't always a grand narrative. Sometimes it's just a terrible accident, a product of bad luck and organizational failure.
And the consequences of that one wrong turn literally define the world that you live in today. Which, if you think about it, raises a really provocative question for all of us.
Which is?
If the entire 20th century could pivot so violently on such a tiny accidental moment back in 1914, what other invisible hinges, what other seemingly minor human errors is our own world turning on right now, completely out of sight?
A thought definitely worth mulling over. Thank you for joining us for the deep dive. We'll be back next time with another close look at the seconds that changed everything.